Genghis Khan, remembered by history as the Khan of the burned earth, a nomadic warlord who swept across continents like a shadow of death, leaving behind nothing but scorched villages, blood-soaked fields, and whispers of terror that refused to die with time. His armies were merciless. Men and the elderly were exterminated without hesitation. Cities burned until their smoke blotted out the horizon. Yet in this reign of devastation, there was one chilling exception. The young girls and women were not killed. They were taken. Taken not for mercy, but for something far darker. And here lies the mystery. What fate awaited the women captured by the most feared conqueror in history? Were they prizes of war, pawns of politics, or victims of something too horrific for chronicles to fully reveal? Those who surrendered to Genghis Khan were spared the sword and instead absorbed into his vast empire. Even enemies who once raised blades against him would later march beneath his banners, bound by the unshakable laws of Yasser that defined his rule. Despite the cruelty of his era, he was hailed as both a ruthless destroyer and a just ruler, a contradiction that made him even more terrifying. For the people of the steppe, he was not merely a conqueror. He was a living legend, generous to allies, noble to followers, yet unrelenting to enemies. They revered him as a god of war, a man who could bring empires to their knees with the force of will alone. But behind the admiration lingered stories few dared to speak aloud. Stories of the women who vanished into his camps. Stories of captives whose screams were swallowed by the night winds of the Mongolian steppe. Stories of an empire built not only on blood and fire, but also on secrets buried deep in the silence of history. And so we ask the question that has haunted generations. What did Genghis Khan truly do with the women he captured? The vast Mongolian steppe stretched endlessly, a rolling ocean of grass that bent beneath the weight of the winds. To outsiders, it was an empty wilderness, a barren land incapable of sustaining glory. But for those who lived there, the steppe was a battlefield, a crucible, and a teacher. It taught only one lesson: survive no matter the cost. Life here was unforgiving. Winters carved flesh from bone, summers scorched the earth until it cracked like broken pottery, and famine prowled in the shadows of every season. In this world, weakness was death. Men were hardened from birth, women carried burdens far beyond their years, and children often learned to kill before they learned to speak. The tribes that roamed these lands fought endlessly, not for wealth or power, but for food, horses, and survival itself. It was here in this world of blood and dust that the boy who would become Genghis Khan was born. His birth name was Temujin, and even in his earliest years his destiny seemed both cursed and blessed. Legend said he was born clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, a sign among the steppe tribes that he was marked for greatness. Yet greatness in the steppe came not through honor, but through conquest. Temujin's childhood was carved from suffering. His father, a tribal chief, was poisoned by enemies when Temujin was still a boy. The family was cast out, stripped of power, left to starve in the wilderness. His mother gathered berries, roots, and whatever scraps the earth would yield, while her children scavenged like wild animals. Hunger gnawed at them relentlessly, reducing once proud bloodlines to shadows of their former selves. For a boy destined to command empires, the taste of desperation became his earliest memory. It was in this crucible of abandonment that Temujin learned to mistrust, to endure, and to fight. He saw brothers turn against brothers, allies betray without hesitation, and the strong consume the weak. He carried scars both visible and unseen, scars that taught him one lesson above all. In a world ruled by cruelty, survival was never given, it was taken. By the time he was a young man, Temujin had already begun reshaping his destiny. Through alliances, cunning, and merciless vengeance, he clawed his way back from obscurity. Those who betrayed him paid in blood. Those who defied him were crushed beneath his will. Step by step, tribe by tribe, he built a following not out of loyalty but out of necessity. To stand against him was to invite annihilation. To stand with him was to gamble for survival. The steppe tribes had long been fractured, locked in endless cycles of feuds and vengeance. Temujin saw what others could not, that unity, even if forged in iron and blood, could make them unstoppable. He bound his followers with absolute discipline, enforcing his authority through the laws of Yasser. This was not justice in the sense of mercy or fairness. It was justice of the sword, unbending, absolute, and merciless. Stealing a horse, the most precious possession of the steppe, could mean death. Desertion was met with execution. Cowardice was eradicated with public brutality. Yet under these same laws, he rewarded loyalty with generosity. Warriors who once fought against him were welcomed if they bent the knee. Even enemies who had once sworn his destruction found themselves honored as long as they swore loyalty to him. It was a system of fear and reward, cruelty and generosity, an iron balance that only he could wield. For the people of the steppe, Temujin was both savior and executioner. He punished disobedience with fire, but rewarded service with wealth and glory. In him, they saw a leader who could give them what they had never known before, unity. Out of this unity, Temujin became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. His name carried the weight of destiny, and his armies grew into a force the world had never witnessed before. But while his followers admired him, his enemies knew him as something else. They whispered of entire cities burned to ash, of rivers running red with blood, of bodies stacked like monuments to terror. Wherever his banners appeared, terror spread ahead of him. Those who resisted were exterminated without mercy. Villages were emptied, fields were left smoking, and the cries of the dying echoed long after the hoofbeats faded. It was a campaign not only of conquest, but of annihilation. And yet, amidst this ruthless extermination, there was a chilling pattern. Men were slaughtered, elders were cast aside, children often perished in the chaos, but young women were spared. Not spared from suffering, but spared from death. Taken, not killed. Their fate, shrouded in silence, would become one of history's most haunting mysteries. To his warriors, Genghis Khan demanded obedience beyond reason. To his enemies, he demanded surrender or extinction. And to those caught in between, the women torn from their homes, their families slaughtered, their identities erased, he offered neither death nor life, but something far more sinister. Yet in this moment, as his power consolidated, none could see the shadow this practice would cast across generations. For now the people of the steppe saw only a conqueror who had risen from nothing, forged by suffering and crowned by blood. They saw a man who had transformed weakness into power, betrayal into strength, and survival into destiny. To them, he was the Khan of Khans. To history, he would become the embodiment of contradiction, admired as a noble leader, yet feared as the architect of nightmares. But beneath the banners of victory, beneath the songs of conquest, the silence of the captured women told another story. A story the chronicles could not erase, a story that even in whispers carried the weight of horror. And so the question remains, when the fires of conquest faded and the men lay in graves of ash, what became of the women taken by Genghis Khan? The transformation of the Mongol tribes into an empire was like the forging of a weapon. From scattered fragments of steel, Genghis Khan shaped a blade so sharp it could cut through civilizations. What began as a coalition of desperate nomads soon became an army unlike any the world had ever seen. Discipline was its lifeblood. Every warrior carried not only weapons, but also the weight of the yasa, the unyielding code of law that bound them. In this world, loyalty was not optional. It was survival. Even a whisper of betrayal could end in execution, swift and merciless. Yet within that same framework, those who proved themselves were elevated no matter their origin. A peasant could ride beside nobles. A former enemy could command thousands if he pledged his allegiance. This balance of terror and reward fueled an unstoppable machine. The Mongols moved like a storm across the steppe, consuming everything in their path. What other armies relied on? Fortifications, slow-moving supply lines, or cumbersome formations, the Mongols abandoned. They lived off the land, their horses sustaining them, their speed overwhelming all resistance. Cities that had stood for centuries collapsed in days. Walls meant nothing before their relentless siegecraft, and with each conquest, the same grim pattern repeated. The men who resisted were slaughtered, their bodies left as a warning. The old, the sick, the weak, erased without hesitation. Children often perished in the chaos, their cries drowned beneath the thunder of hooves. And then the young women were taken. To outsiders it seemed a contradiction. How could a leader so ruthless in extermination spare anyone? But for Genghis Khan, these choices were deliberate. Women were not spared out of mercy, but out of purpose. Some were taken as concubines, others forced into marriages, and still others scattered as spoils for his warriors. Their bodies became part of the empire's currency, a tool to reward loyalty, cement alliances, and ensure obedience. Yet the chronicles remain strangely silent on the intimate details. Historians wrote of his victories, his laws, his strategies. They praised his genius and feared his wrath. But when it came to the women dragged away from smoldering cities, their voices were lost. Their suffering became an unspoken truth, a shadow hidden behind the glory of conquest. The Mongol armies pushed outward, spreading from the steppe into lands that had never imagined such ferocity. North into the frozen forests of Siberia, west into the Muslim Khanates, south into the wealth of China, and beyond into Persia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. No land was too distant, no kingdom too proud. One after another, they fell. With each victory, the numbers of the captured grew. Caravans of survivors trailed behind the armies, women torn from their homes, stripped not only of their freedom, but also of their identity. For the conquerors, they were trophies. For the conquered, they were the embodiment of humiliation, a living reminder that resistance meant destruction, submission meant survival, and dignity was a luxury no longer afforded. But even within this brutality, contradictions emerged. Genghis Khan was revered by his people as a ruler who rewarded loyalty, who punished corruption, who upheld order where chaos once reigned. Former enemies who submitted found themselves respected, sometimes even honored. Entire nations were absorbed into his empire. Their leaders offered positions of power if they bowed to his will. For men who chose to surrender, there was often a chance at survival. But for women, surrender meant something else entirely. To be spared was to be claimed. To be alive was to be bound. Their survival was not their own. It was dictated by the conqueror, who saw them not as individuals, but as pieces in the architecture of empire. As the Mongol armies stretched across continents, their reputation grew into something larger than life. Stories of cities burned to ash, of rivers clogged with corpses, of entire populations extinguished, traveled faster than the armies themselves. Fear became their greatest weapon. Some cities surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid the fate of those who resisted. Yet even surrender could not erase the silence of the women carried away. Historians estimate that millions perished in Genghis Khan's campaigns. But numbers cannot capture the horror of those left alive, the women who vanished into the Mongol horde. They became mothers of new lineages, unwilling foundations of bloodlines that spread across Asia and Europe. Genetic studies centuries later would reveal the staggering truth. The blood of Genghis Khan, multiplied through countless women, flowed through millions of descendants. What history celebrated as the expansion of empire was, for those women, the erasure of self. Their bodies became vessels of conquest, their voices drowned beneath songs of victory, their suffering dismissed as the price of empire. For his followers, Genghis Khan was remembered as a just leader, a noble ruler, the man who brought order to the steppe. But for those who lived in the ashes of his conquest, he was something else entirely. The architect of despair, the shadow that consumed futures, the hand that tore daughters from mothers and erased their names from memory. And so, as the Mongol Empire rose from the dust of conquered lands, it carried with it not only banners of triumph, but also the silent burden of those who could not speak. For the men, death was often swift. For the women, survival was a chain, a fate that lingered far beyond the battlefield. This silence became the true legacy of conquest, a silence that history has yet to break. And as the empire stretched further, swallowing kingdoms and rewriting maps, one question grew louder in the shadows, a question history itself seemed afraid to answer. What truly happened to the women captured by Genghis Khan? The Mongol Empire did not rise quietly. It erupted from the steppe like a storm, rolling across continents with the force of inevitability. When Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward, the tribes he had unified became a war machine sharper than any sword, swifter than any wind, and more relentless than famine itself. To the kingdoms and empires beyond the steppe, the Mongols seemed less like men and more like an elemental disaster, something that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or contained. They descended upon cities the way fire consumes dry wood, leaving behind only ashes and silence. But fire was only half the weapon. The other half was terror. Genghis Khan understood that fear traveled faster than armies. News of his massacres preceded him, carried by terrified refugees, scattered survivors, and merchants who had glimpsed the aftermath of his wrath. Cities surrendered without resistance, simply at the sound of his name. For those who dared defy him, extermination was absolute. It was not enough to defeat enemies. They had to be annihilated in ways so horrifying that no one would ever dare resist again. The chronicles describe rivers running red, fields piled with corpses, and streets so thick with blood that even horses refused to step forward. In Persia, the great city of Nishapur was reduced to a graveyard of bones. Chroniclers claimed that hundreds of thousands were slain in a single campaign. Numbers so staggering, they blur the line between history and nightmare. In China, entire provinces were laid bare, their wealth consumed, their people obliterated. In the lands of the Rus, towns were razed so thoroughly that centuries later, travelers still found ruins haunted by whispers of that destruction. And yet, amid this orgy of slaughter, there was a strange pattern. Men were butchered without hesitation. The old and infirm were discarded like husks. Children too small to be useful often perished in the chaos. But the young women were spared. They were not spared out of mercy. Mercy had no place in the Mongol vocabulary. They were spared because their bodies had value. In the aftermath of conquest, the women were divided. Some were taken as concubines, their lives consumed by the service of men who saw them not as human beings, but as possessions, rewards, or symbols of victory. Others were forced into marriages that bound them to the empire, their identities erased and rewritten in the language of submission. Still others were handed out to soldiers as spoils, tokens of loyalty given in flesh instead of gold. For the Mongols, women became currency. A captured girl could cement the loyalty of a warrior. A noble woman seized from a defeated city could be used to forge a political alliance. A concubine taken from an enemy household could serve both as a reminder of conquest and as a womb for future heirs. This was the silent machinery beneath the roar of conquest. Cities burned, men died, but the women endured, if endurance can be called survival. They lived not for themselves, but for the empire that consumed them. And in this a deeper injustice unfolded, the erasure of voices. The chronicles of the Mongols were written by men for men about men. They praised the brilliance of Genghis Khan's strategies, the discipline of his warriors, the immensity of his empire. But they did not record the cries of the women carried into darkness. They did not write of the daughters who vanished from their mother's arms, the wives who saw their husbands butchered before being dragged into captivity, the noble women stripped of titles and transformed into instruments of submission. History celebrated the empire. Silence devoured the women. The Mongol expansion into Persia provides one of the clearest glimpses of this horror. When the Khwarezmian Empire resisted Genghis Khan, its cities were put to the sword. Men of fighting age were executed en masse, their corpses left as monuments of warning. But noble families were not merely destroyed, they were consumed. Daughters of the elite were seized, their beauty treated as a prize of war. Wives of rulers were forced into the harems of their conquerors. In the shadow of these atrocities, the women became living reminders of defeat. Their existence was humiliation itself, proof that even bloodlines could be conquered and bent to the will of the Khan. In China, the process repeated. The Jin dynasty, rich and proud, fell before the Mongol tide. Towns were emptied, villages reduced to rubble. Yet among the rubble, young women were collected like resources. The empire grew not only through fire and steel, but through the wombs of its captives. It was conquest of bloodlines as much as territory. Centuries later, modern science would uncover the genetic legacy of this brutality. A staggering portion of the world's population carries traces of Genghis Khan's lineage, a haunting reminder that his conquests were written not only on the land, but also in the bodies of countless women. Each descendant carries the silent testimony of survival forced upon their ancestors. What history framed as empire building was, in truth, a legacy of violation written into flesh. The Mongols did not see this as cruelty. To them it was practicality. Women were spoils that ensured warriors remained loyal, allies remained bound, and bloodlines remained strong. Conquered men might be exterminated, but conquered women could be absorbed into the empire, their children raised as Mongols, their identities erased in the process. In this way, conquest was permanent. The racial hierarchies of empire grew sharper with each conquest. To be Mongol was to be dominant, to hold life and death in your hands. To be conquered was to be erased unless you could be of use. Women became the bridge between those two worlds, not because they were given choice, but because they were stripped of it. Their lives were the empire's, their bodies the battlefield where conquest was consummated. And always silence shrouded their fate. Chroniclers recorded numbers, how many thousands were slaughtered, how many cities destroyed, but they did not record the screams that echoed in the night after the soldiers returned to their camps. They did not record the eyes of mothers watching their daughters disappear into the darkness. They did not record the silence that followed, the silence of women who learned that survival meant obedience, and that resistance meant a death far worse than the sword. The contradiction only deepened the horror. While men across Asia and Europe feared Genghis Khan as a ruthless destroyer, those who served him admired him as a just ruler. They praised his discipline, his fairness, his willingness to reward loyalty regardless of origin. To his warriors he was generous. To his allies he was noble. To his people he was the embodiment of strength. But for the women taken in his conquests, admiration was meaningless. Justice was a myth. Nobility was an illusion. Their survival was built on silence, and their stories were erased even as the empire they sustained rose to unimaginable heights. This was the hidden foundation of Mongol glory, not only the blood of slaughtered men, but the silence of captured women, not only the ashes of cities, but the erased names of daughters who never returned, not only the fear of annihilation, but the knowledge that even survival could be worse than death. As the empire spread further west, into the lands of the Rus and beyond into Eastern Europe, the same terror unfolded again and again. Villages vanished overnight. Fortresses crumbled before the Mongol onslaught. And always after the flames died down and the corpses cooled, the women were taken. Their fate was never recorded in detail. Perhaps it was too shameful to write. Perhaps it was too ordinary in an age of brutality. Or perhaps, as with so many injustices, the world simply did not care to remember. But we, centuries later, are left to ask, what was it like for them? What did they see in those nights of conquest? What did they endure in silence, erased from history even as their blood carried into the future? The rising action of this story is not the victories of Genghis Khan, nor the brilliance of his strategies, nor the vastness of his empire. It is the growing realization that beneath the songs of conquest lay a silence so profound it screams across the centuries. And this silence leads us toward the darkest part of the tale, the climax where the horrors, long hidden in whispers and shadows, can no longer be ignored. The Mongol storm did not falter. With every passing year, Genghis Khan's armies grew larger, sharper, and more ruthless. What had begun as scattered raids across the steppe had transformed into a tidal wave swallowing entire civilizations. Kingdoms that once believed themselves invincible learned that stone walls and iron gates were no defense against riders who moved like shadows and struck like thunder. The secret of Mongol success lay not only in their discipline or speed, but in the deliberate orchestration of fear. Terror was weaponized with precision. Entire populations were slaughtered not out of necessity, but as a warning, their deaths echoing across borders before the Mongols even arrived. This calculated cruelty broke spirits before battles began. Resistance collapsed not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who dreaded what surrender might bring. But surrender too carried its own horrors. For the men it often meant servitude or execution. For the women, surrender meant something darker, a different kind of captivity, a prison without walls where survival itself became a form of erasure. In conquered cities, women were divided as spoils. Some were handed over to soldiers as rewards, their bodies treated as payment for loyalty. Others were claimed by commanders, bound not by chains but by fear. The most beautiful or highborn were reserved for the Khan himself or for his sons and generals, their lives transformed into tools of politics and empire. A noble woman's marriage could erase centuries of resistance, binding her bloodline to the Mongol yoke. This practice was not random. It was systemic. By consuming the daughters of defeated kingdoms, the Mongols consumed the kingdoms themselves. Bloodlines that once defined nations were folded into the empire. Future heirs carried Mongol blood, their very existence a testament to conquest. The empire did not simply conquer land, it conquered identity. Nowhere was this clearer than in Persia. When Genghis Khan's forces descended upon the Khwarezmian Empire, resistance was met with extermination. Chroniclers wrote of mountains of skulls, of entire cities reduced to dust. But amid the carnage noble families were seized. Their daughters vanished into the Mongol horde. Their names, once symbols of dynasties, became whispers in camps where no chronicler dared record them. Survival for these women did not mean freedom. It meant becoming instruments of the very empire that had destroyed their homes. In China, the same pattern repeated. The Jin dynasty, once a powerful rival, fell to Mongol discipline and unrelenting force. When their cities collapsed, the women of the ruling class were absorbed. Some chronicles, written centuries later, suggest that daughters of the defeated were forced into marriages with Mongol princes, ensuring that the blood of the vanquished now flowed within the veins of the conquerors. What had once been dynasties were reduced to lineages in service of empire. In the West, as the Mongols advanced toward the Rus and beyond, villages were erased overnight. Survivors who lived to tell of it spoke of devastation so total it seemed less like war and more like apocalypse. And always when the fires burned out, when the corpses were left to rot, the women were gone. Their fate was an open secret, a truth so obvious no one dared write it. Chroniclers praised the brilliance of Mongol generals, the vastness of their empire, the inevitability of their triumphs. They recorded numbers, tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands enslaved, but they did not record the lives of the women taken. Silence consumed them, as if to speak of their suffering was to acknowledge an injustice too immense for history to contain. Yet the legacy of their silence lives on. Centuries later, scientists would discover that as much as 1 in every 200 men alive carried traces of Genghis Khan's lineage. His bloodline had spread across continents, an empire carved not only by the sword, but by the wombs of women who had no voice, no choice, and no escape. This genetic echo is not triumph. It is testimony. Each descendant is living proof of women who endured survival as captivity, who bore children not from love or choice, but from conquest. Their bodies became battlegrounds, where empire was written into the future, and yet even in silence their suffering shaped history. By absorbing conquered women into the empire, Genghis Khan ensured that resistance would fade. The blood of the conquered now fed the veins of the conqueror. A daughter of Persia could give birth to a son who would ride beneath the Mongol banner. A princess of the Jin could produce heirs loyal to the Khan. A nameless girl from a village razed to ash could raise children who would never know her language, her customs, or her name. This was conquest, not just of land or people, but of memory itself. The contradiction of Genghis Khan's image deepened with every passing conquest. To his followers, he was a lawgiver, a man of fairness who punished corruption, rewarded loyalty, and demanded discipline. To those who survived beneath his rule, he was sometimes even admired as a just ruler who brought order where chaos had reigned. But for the women carried away in silence, justice was a word without meaning. Nobility was a mask that hid their chains. Generosity was a reward they would never taste. Their survival became a paradox. To live was to vanish. Their stories were not written, their names not preserved, their lives remembered only in the genetic footprints they left behind. As the Mongol armies pushed deeper into the known world, this silence only grew heavier. Chroniclers could describe the thunder of hooves, the smoke of burning cities, the mountains of corpses, but they could not describe the nights after, when the women taken from those same cities disappeared into tents, their cries swallowed by the winds of the steppe. And here lies the true horror, that history itself conspired in their erasure, that the empire which claimed to bring unity instead fractured voices, silenced generations, and left only questions in its wake. The rising action now closes in on the darkest question of all. If the fate of the women was so carefully hidden, so thoroughly erased, then what truths lie waiting in the shadows of history? What horrors were so immense that even chroniclers who had recorded rivers of blood and mountains of skulls could not bring themselves to write them down? That silence draws us toward the edge of the abyss, toward the climax of this story, where the unspeakable cannot remain hidden forever. The Mongol Empire had become a storm without horizon, a force so vast and merciless that no border, no wall, no king could hold against it. In its shadow, cities that had flourished for centuries vanished in days. Trade routes that had once carried silk, jewels, and spices now carried only rumors of approaching death. And at the heart of this storm was Genghis Khan, the man the world would remember as both a lawgiver and a destroyer, both a unifier and a scourge. Among the chronicles of his reign, one name still chills the blood: Nishapur. In the year 1221, the city rose in defiance after a Mongol commander, kin to the Khan himself, was slain. The response was swift, brutal, and absolute. The Mongols surrounded Nishapur, and when its walls fell, the city ceased to exist in any form recognizable to memory. Chroniclers speak of hundreds of thousands put to the sword. Some wrote of 1.7 million souls extinguished, though even if the number is exaggerated, the horror was real. Pyramids of skulls were raised outside the city gates as monuments to terror. The earth ran black with blood. Those who lived to see the ruins said the silence afterward was so heavy it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing. Yet in that silence another fate unfolded, one the chronicles do not linger on. While the men of Nishapur were executed, while the elderly and children were cast aside, the young women were separated. Their lives were not spared out of mercy, but repurposed into something far more insidious. For the Mongols, victory was not complete with slaughter alone. It required absorption, the folding of the defeated into the bloodstream of empire. What became of those women? History does not name them. It does not tell us how many were divided among the soldiers as rewards for loyalty, or how many were reserved for the commanders who orchestrated the city's destruction. It does not tell us which were given to Genghis Khan himself, or sent as gifts to his sons, or kept in secret to bear children destined to ride beneath the very banners that had slaughtered their families. This silence is more haunting than the mountains of skulls. For bones remain, but voices erased can never return. Nishapur was not an isolated horror. It was a pattern repeated across Persia, Khwarezm, China, and beyond. Each conquest carried with it the same machinery of extermination: the annihilation of men, the erasure of elders, and the silent absorption of women. Chroniclers, eager to record numbers of the dead, somehow passed over the nights that followed, the nights when camps filled with the cries of women torn from their homes, their names and lineages erased in an empire that thrived on erasure. To understand the magnitude of this silence, one must imagine the contradiction at its core. To his own people, Genghis Khan was a figure of justice. He punished thieves, upheld loyalty, and demanded discipline. He was admired as a ruler who lifted his people from obscurity to dominance. And yet, beneath this mask of law and nobility, he presided over atrocities that bent the very fabric of humanity. His justice was not for the conquered. His mercy did not reach the women taken from burning cities. The survivors of conquest knew the truth. To be spared was not to be free. It was to vanish into a new kind of captivity, one that erased language, faith, and memory. Women became living spoils, trophies of conquest and tools of empire. Their lives served as rewards, as bargaining chips, as instruments of assimilation. Even more chilling was the deliberate nature of this practice. The Mongols did not merely conquer for plunder or land, they conquered for legacy. By taking women into their fold, they rewrote the bloodlines of nations. Every child born of these forced unions became a living monument to conquest, carrying Mongol blood into generations that would never again remember the songs, prayers, or traditions of the mothers who bore them. Centuries later, genetic studies would reveal a staggering truth. Nearly 16 million men alive today bear the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan. 1 in every 200 men carries his lineage. This is not simply a tale of virility or chance, it is a map of silence. It is the mathematical proof of countless women absorbed into an empire not by choice, but by force. Imagine the scale of that suffering. Every statistic is a grave, every genetic echo is a name erased, and yet the world remembers the pyramids of skulls more vividly than it remembers the fate of these women. Terror carved in stone and bone was easier to record than terror written in flesh. Chroniclers found poetry in rivers of blood, but left the silence of women unspoken. The brutality of slaughter was spectacular. The brutality of survival was unbearable. This is why the climax of Genghis Khan's story is not only the roar of battles or the collapse of kingdoms. It is in the silence that followed, the unrecorded, unacknowledged, unhealed silence. The women of Nishapur, the daughters of Persia, the princesses of the Jinn, the nameless, countless captives who carried empire in their wombs while their own histories were obliterated. The true horror is not what was written, but what was deliberately left unwritten. At Nishapur, the skulls rose high enough to darken the horizon, but the cries of the women carried into the night, lost on winds that no chronicler dared capture. Those winds blow still across centuries, whispering of a silence too heavy for history to bear. And as the Mongol Empire marched westward, as Europe itself trembled at rumors of its approach, that silence marched with it, an army of unspoken stories, a legacy of erasure as vast and enduring as the empire itself. The question lingers sharper than any sword. If chroniclers who recorded rivers of blood could not bring themselves to describe what happened to the women, then what horrors lay hidden in that silence? The silence of conquest was never empty. It was filled with whispers that history refused to record, echoes of nights darker than the massacres that preceded them. Where chronicles described piles of skulls and oceans of blood, they remained mute about what happened when the fires burned low, when victory feasts ended, and when the surviving women of conquered cities disappeared into the shadows of Mongol tents. The absence of their voices is itself a kind of violence. To erase testimony is to kill memory, and the Mongols, masters of destruction, also became masters of erasure. Take the fall of Bukhara, a city of wealth and faith, a jewel of Central Asia. When Genghis Khan entered its grand mosque, he declared himself the scourge of God, sent to punish corruption and weakness. Chroniclers recorded the moment with awe, painting him as both divine wrath and earthly conqueror. They described the fire, the slaughter, the ruin of a city that had once shone with learning. But again the record breaks when it comes to the fate of the women. Their lives ended not in the stroke of a blade, but in the slow suffocation of captivity, or the devastation of Merv, where more than 700,000 were said to have perished in one of the greatest massacres in human history. The chroniclers noted the count of the dead with cold precision. They even marveled at the efficiency of destruction, as if calculating the worth of terror itself. But in the tally of loss, the women are missing. They were not counted among the dead because their bodies had another purpose. Their survival was a continuation of conquest, written in silence rather than ink. The pattern repeated across continents. In every kingdom swallowed by Mongol expansion, the men were slaughtered or enslaved, the rulers humiliated, the treasures looted. But the women, always the women, were absorbed. Some became concubines in royal courts, their beauty weaponized for diplomacy. Others were distributed among soldiers, their bodies serving as compensation for blood spilled in battle. Many more vanished nameless, their lineage erased, their children raised as Mongols who would never know the language or faith of their mothers. This is the hidden genocide within the empire, not of flesh but of identity, annihilation not only of people but of memory. And yet the silence could never be total. It lingers in fragments, in accidental traces. A Persian chronicler once wrote, almost in passing, of maidens taken as tribute. A Chinese source buried deep in annals mentions daughters absorbed into the Khan's household. These small, almost casual notes reveal the enormity of what was left unsaid. For if a chronicler could write without hesitation of pyramids of skulls, why falter at the fate of the women, unless that fate was too vast, too common, too horrific to capture in words? Centuries later, science would uncover what history refused to. The genetic legacy of Genghis Khan spreads like a shadow across Eurasia. His Y chromosome is present in millions of men alive today, a silent reminder of women whose survival was rewritten into empire. Each genetic echo is a monument not of glory but of silence, a testimony that their suffering was real even if their names were not preserved. The true climax of Genghis Khan's story, then, is not the roar of battle or the thunder of hooves. It is this unending silence, the silence of the women whose lives were consumed, whose stories were denied, whose identities were obliterated and replaced by the bloodline of their conqueror. Imagine standing before the ruins of Nishapur or Merv, centuries later. The dust is quiet, the bones long gone. Yet beneath that soil lie voices that history refused to carry. Their cries are not in the chronicles, but they exist in the genetic footprints scattered across the living. Every descendant who bears the Khan's bloodline is both proof of conquest and witness to silence. And this silence is the most terrifying legacy of all. Armies may fall, cities may crumble, empires may vanish, but the deliberate erasure of memory endures, invisible yet suffocating. The Mongols mastered not only the destruction of civilizations, but also the rewriting of their survival. The question that chills us now is the same that haunted those who lived under Mongol conquest. What horrors were so great, so unspeakable, that even chroniclers of oceans of blood could not bring themselves to record them? The climax closes not in the clash of swords or the blaze of fire, but in this abyss of silence. A silence heavier than stone, darker than night, stretching across centuries. The silence of millions of women erased, their suffering hidden behind the glory of empire, their names lost but their scars etched forever into the DNA of the living. And in that silence lies the truest horror of all. The empire of Genghis Khan eventually fractured, as all empires do. The thunder of hooves faded, the fires died out, and the once unstoppable horde dissolved into history. Yet the silence he left behind never ended. It lingers still, woven into bloodlines, etched into forgotten graves, carried in the absence of voices that should have been remembered. We often speak of Genghis Khan as a lawgiver, a unifier, a man who reshaped the world. We marvel at his genius in war, his discipline, his ability to forge an empire that stretched farther than Rome, farther than Alexander. But in that admiration, we risk repeating history's greatest injustice, overlooking those who paid the price. The women of Nishapur, of Bukhara, of Merv, of Jin, and of countless nameless villages. What became of them? Their lives were not written in chronicles, but in silence. Their children carried the blood of the conqueror, yet their own stories vanished like ash in the wind. They were not remembered as mothers, daughters, or sisters, but as spoils of war, as instruments of empire. That is the truest horror, that bones could be counted, but voices could not. That skulls were raised as monuments, but women disappeared into erasure. That history, in all its detail, chose silence where testimony was needed most. And so the question remains, one we must still ask today. If history can erase millions of voices, how many more stories lie buried in silence? How many more injustices have been hidden, unspoken, unrecorded, simply because those who suffered them were never allowed to speak? The legacy of Genghis Khan is not only measured in the vastness of his empire, nor in the millions who bear his blood. It is measured in the silence he left behind, the silence of women who endured survival as captivity, whose names are lost, but whose suffering shaped the world we live in. And perhaps the only way to honor them now is to break that silence, to remember what history refused to write, to ask again and again, what voices are we still ignoring today?